Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Powley. I'm the chair of the Greater Lafayette Holocaust Remembrance Committee. Our organization was founded in 1981 by the mayors of Lafayette and West Lafayette and Rabbi Gedalia Engel, who was then the director of Hillel at Purdue, and other community faith leaders. Our organization is entirely volunteer. We depend upon contributions and in-kind support from individual, corporate, and community entities, including the City of Lafayette and the City of West Lafayette. We are supported in our work by these entities at Purdue: the Division of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Education, the Ackerman Center for Democratic Citizenship, the Department of History, the Jewish Studies Program, and the Human Rights Program, which is co-hosting this event with us today. And these faith communities: Temple Israel, Sons of Abraham, Chabad at Purdue, and Hillel at Purdue. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for your support. The goals of the GLHRC are to remember the victims of the Holocaust and to educate and inspire individuals, institutions, and the media to act responsibly and compassionately in the face of prejudice and discrimination today. These are the precursors of genocide, from which no country is immune from tolerating or perpetrating. We remember the Holocaust and its lessons and believe that all of us have a responsibility to understand and confront contemporary violations of human rights. Before we begin, it's important to recognize that we are here today at Purdue University on the traditional homelands of the indigenous people. We honor and appreciate the Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, and Shawnee people, who are the original indigenous caretakers. The theme for our event this spring, all of our events this spring, is this: Preventing Evil. What can we do? Our speaker, Dr. James Waller, is the 2024 Gedalia Engel Lecturer, and he will address our theme directly. In his lecture, Confronting Evil, Engaging Our Responsibility to Prevent Genocide, he will discuss genocide prevention, mitigation strategies when genocide is happening, and approaches to restoring society in the aftermath. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Rebecca Klein-Pesheva, Associate Professor of History and co-director of the Human Rights Program here at Purdue. Professor Klein-Pesheva will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Klein-Pesheva. I'm an associate professor of history here and co-director of the Human Rights Program. Thank you for coming here this afternoon for this important talk. I am honored to present Dr. James Waller, who will be speaking with us here today about confronting evil. Dr. Waller is the inaugural Christopher J. Dodd Chair in Human Rights Practice at the University of Connecticut at UConn. He also directs the Dodd Human Rights Impact Programs for the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute and is a professor of literature, cultures, languages, and human rights. He is the author of 6 books, most notably his award-winning Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing. These well-worn copies here: Confronting Evil, Engaging Our Responsibility to Prevent Genocide, and A Troubled Sleep: Risk and Resilience in Contemporary Northern Ireland. Many of you in this room have read Dr. Waller's works in classes with me and with others. His work has been called required reading for all those who seek to understand and avert atrocities, for good reason. In remembrance and hope for a better future, please welcome James Waller.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. Thank you, Rebecca, for the kind words. Thank you for being here. I hope some of the tension has settled over the past week or so. Running up to this about 2 weeks ago, I thought, no, this can't happen. This cannot happen. And it happened. So I think we're all friends. Everything's settled. That said, I can't get a picture of me behind a podium with Purdue University on it because I'd like to keep my job at UConn, so I will slide over here. Can you still hear me okay? Perfect. Again, thank you for taking the time to be here tonight. What we want to talk about is the question of prevention, of how to prevent genocide and other mass atrocities, which include war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I'll start with this. This is a monument from the concentration camp Dachau, the former concentration camp. And you'll see the phrase, never again. You'll see the phrase in a couple different languages here. The first time we ever heard or saw the phrase never again was at the liberation of another concentration camp in Buchenwald. A Russian prisoner of war at liberation in April 1945 was standing behind the fence, the infamous barbed wire fences of the concentration camp, and he's holding up a sign in Russian that translated into English as the two-word phrase, never again. That mantra, that phrase, has become a mantra for many people in the field. How many of you have visited the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C.? So you go to the gift store there, the bookstore, you can find any number of items with the phrase never again on it. T-shirts, posters, bumper stickers, keychains, rocks with it engraved on it. It really has become a mantra in the field. You can find organizations with the title Never Again. You can find books with the title Never Again. But the sad reality, and what we're here talking about tonight, is as journalist David Reef once wrote, never again only has meaning if by it you mean never again would Germans kill Jews in Europe in the 1940s. If that's what never again means, it's true. But if never again means never again would we see anything like we saw in Europe in the 1940s, nothing could be farther from the truth. Probably the phrase is better again and again, yet again, ever again, because it keeps repeating itself. Just 2 weeks ago, the latest atrocity forecasting project came out from Australian National University. They do this every 3 years. There are any number of groups in the world that lay out these maps with hot zones, countries, areas that we're concerned about. I think this particular forecasting project does the work better than almost anyone else in the field. So they're ones I pay particular attention to. 2 weeks ago, this is the heat map they produced, that from 2024 to 2026, this is where they anticipate the highest risk for the possibility of genocide, which is destruction aimed at national, ethical, racial, or religious groups, or politicide, which is destruction aimed at political groups. You'll see Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil, but you see the real hot spots up through sub-Saharan Africa, up into the Middle East, up into Russia. These are the 15 countries they list as highest risk over the next 3 years: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Tajikistan, Nigeria, Iran, Yemen, Philippines, Syria, Egypt, Cameroon, Turkey, Rwanda, Chad, Ethiopia. That's just the 15 highest. They have another dozen that are still countries that are at moderate risk here. So we see this all across the globe. We look at this list and we notice a couple things. One is, and we'll come back to talk about this at the end of the time tonight, you see a country like Rwanda, still listed here. Rwanda just went through a genocide 30 years ago. This month, that genocide started. 800,000 people killed over the course of 100 days. Some people hold up Rwanda as a tremendous success story for how well it's recovered after that atrocity. Many people, and I put myself in this group, look at it as a little bit less of a success story. It's a success that's come at some cost, and that costs leave it here at high risk for potential genocide. You also notice that there are some conflicts that take up a lot of our attention today that aren't on this type of forecast model. So Ukraine is not on here. These type of models don't forecast someone like Putin, an autocrat, who in his confused imagination decides he wants to reclaim a piece of land that he thinks should be his, that he thinks belonged to Russia. We can't forecast that type of crazy, for lack of a better word. We can't forecast terrorist attacks like we saw on October 7th. But we do have some pretty remarkable success understanding what are the factors that leave countries at risk for these type of atrocities. So you look at a world today in which we live, if never again were true, we don't have this slide. We don't have countries listed here. But as Sarah said in the introduction, the truth is every country in the world, all 194 member states of the UN, every country in the world is at risk for genocide and mass atrocity. We just differ in the level of risk. And these 15 countries, Atrocity Forecast Project says, these are the countries currently highest at risk. So how we'll talk about prevention tonight is to think about it in these three stages or these three phases of a cycle of prevention. This is important because I've done work over the past 15 years with government policymakers, military and police from around the world on issues of prevention. When we started that work 15 years ago, when people, and we still see this a little bit today, when people heard us talking about genocide prevention, what their mind went to immediately was military intervention. That's what people thought genocide prevention was. And still today, you can find policymakers with whom, when you raise the question of preventing genocide and atrocities, their immediate thought is boots on the ground. You get a bigger force on the ground and you stop the killing with physical force. If that's all we understand about prevention, that's a failure of our moral imagination. We have to be more creative than that when we think about how to prevent these atrocities. So I've laid out here a framework that talks about prevention following a population health model in 3 stages or 3 cycles that are all part of one cycle. So in reality, we're always doing the work of prevention. So we have the before piece, what I've called upstream prevention, which simply means let's look at the risk factors and let's, based on those risk factors, try to find ways to reduce risk in at-risk countries. Try to find ways to build resilience to counter the effects of risk in these countries. This type of upstream prevention is the most important prevention we can do. It's the least costly form of prevention. It's the most effective form of prevention. And it's the form of prevention that will save the greatest number of lives. So we want to put a lot of work here into upstream prevention. Even if that type of prevention fails, we still haven't given up on prevention. We've simply moved into a different part of the cycle, midstream prevention. What do we do now that the crisis has unfolded? How do we prevent it from getting worse? How do we limit it? How do we mitigate it? How do we hopefully stop it? And then finally, when the crisis is over, then we've moved into this final stage of the cycle of downstream prevention. How do we rebuild a society that has torn itself apart? Why is Rwanda on the at-risk list now, 30 years after genocide? Because they've made choices about rebuilding that have actually increased risk in some cases and decreased resilience. So another way you can think about these 3 forms of prevention is, if you think about it again from a health perspective, upstream prevention is what are the good habits we do to try to prevent heart disease, heart attack, stroke. We eat well, we lose weight, we don't smoke, we exercise, we try to live in a healthy way that isn't going to eliminate the possibility of heart disease, but we're simply trying to reduce it. That's upstream prevention, best form of prevention for us to take. Let's say for whatever reason the upstream prevention fails or is limited. We have a crisis, we have a stroke, we have some form of heart disease. Do we give up on life at that point? No, we're still trying to save life. Now the options are more limited in midstream. We don't have the range of options we have upstream. The options are limited, the options are costly, but we're still trying to preserve life. And then if we've preserved life, if we've recovered from whatever has ailed us with the heart disease, then we're in downstream. How do we rebuild a healthy life to ensure that we don't fall prey to this disease again? So this is how we think about prevention. So what I want to do with you is go through each of these three forms of prevention, give you some examples of how we think about them and how they work going forward in terms of preventing atrocities. Let's talk first about the first one, which is upstream. This has to do with the risk factors. I have here two competing metaphors. On the right-hand side, you see a black swan. Black swans are extremely rare in nature. I hope that's true here. I used this example one time in Australia, and in the Q&A, some woman went off for 10 minutes on how frequent black swans are in Australia. So if this isn't true, just stay with me. But I think black swans are typically rare. We see them, we notice them, they stand out because they're so unusual, and we say, I didn't get up today expecting to see a black swan, and I saw one. That's pretty remarkable. This is how we used to think 20, 25 years ago about cases of genocide, mass atrocity. They happened. Cambodia happens. Rwanda happens. Bosnia-Herzegovina happens. And the general reaction is, wow, we didn't see it coming. Didn't expect this to happen. This is so rare. This is so extreme. We couldn't have done anything because we didn't see it coming. There's no defense for this any longer today. Today, we know enough about risk factors that the better metaphor is this charging rhino in front of us. We know what the risk looks like. We can see it coming. We know what triggers the risk. We know what turns risk into reality. We have a ton of evidence for this now that we've garnered in the past couple of decades. So any policymaker today, or any member of the public who says, yeah, we just didn't see it coming, it's willful neglect that you didn't look for it, because if you had looked for it, you would have seen it coming. Another way to think about this is to think of risk as a stack of wood. Every country has a stack of wood in it. Some countries, the stack of wood is really high. This is an image from where? Does anyone know? That's Northern Ireland. I spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland. This is the marching season. Every July 12th, Protestant communities in Northern Ireland, the conflict there is between nominally Protestant and Catholic. Protestant communities every July 12th to commemorate a battle over Catholics that they won in 1690, build bonfires. And on the night of the 11th, they will light the bonfires in anticipation of the 12th. There'll be a lot of drinking, there'll be a lot of partying, and it's just a big night in Protestant communities. They start to build these bonfires in February. This one is several stories high. You see the person on top of the bonfire waving the British flag. Every community is proud, every Protestant community, of these bonfires, these stacks of wood that they build. So when we think about risk in any given country, really what we're asking is, how big is the stack of wood in this country? And we're trying to pay attention to countries where the stack of wood is big. Now, what becomes really concerning for us is what happens when this wood is doused in gasoline, as this wood will be on the night of the 11th, and what happens when this wood is lit afire. This is what it looks like in Northern Ireland. Fire patrols in Northern Ireland know if they come to this fire, and they will come to it, they don't do anything with the fire. Because if they put any water on the fire, they'll be accused of stepping on the cultural heritage of Protestants, and something really big will break out. So what they do is they just douse the houses next to the fires to try to keep them safe. But in terms of genocide prevention, what we're concerned about here are countries that have a lot of wood stacked, accelerants that have soaked that wood in gasoline, and then triggers like elections, assassinations, natural disasters, pandemics that can light that wood afire. So if you're interested in more in Northern Ireland, this is the book Rebecca mentioned in the beginning, A Troubled Sleep. That's a case study of risk and resilience in contemporary Northern Ireland. These are the 4 categories that I looked at in terms of trying to understand risk in a given society. So any country can look at itself, or we can look at any country, and I have 4 categories here that have risk factors within them that have strong quantitative, qualitative evidence as risk factors for genocide, mass atrocity. The 4 categories are governance, conflict history, economic conditions, and social fragmentation. So let's look at these briefly because, again, upstream prevention is the most important form of prevention we can do. Understanding risk is important because the other side of the coin of risk is resilience. If we know what puts a country at risk of mass violence, then we can look at the other side and say, if we want to reduce that risk, build resilience, these are some strategies we can use. So we'll look quickly at these. These are the 5 risk factors I look at with governance, the type of regime, whether or not the state is considered legitimate, how weak or strong are the state structures, is there identity-based polar factionalism in the system of governance, and does the government system engage in systematic state-led discrimination? So all of these, we can get information about these from people on the ground. All of these also we can get quantitative data from a wide range of data banks that allow us to make some judgments in terms of risk. So for instance, state legitimacy deficit. One of the big factors we're concerned about there is corruption. States that have high levels of corruption, we worry about because the citizens of the state will tend to view the state as less legitimate. And in turn, the power holders will recognize that the way to stay in power is to keep the systems of corruption moving. So several years ago, we did a 1-day seminar on a Saturday morning in Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, for high school students in the region. We expected about 20 people. We had over 200 kids show up. I mean, we had to move the venue because so many kids showed up. We talked to them about issues of identity as a source of violence and conflict. We asked them to think about their own identity, and we asked them in one word to describe how they thought of themselves and their identity. And it was surprising. Most of them didn't say Bosniak, Croat, or Serb. Most of them said unemployed. And they looked at their future and they said, I just don't see a future for myself here. I think I'm going to be unemployed. That's what my future holds. When we ask, well, what about going to university? University is free for you. It's a great opportunity to go to university. Maybe make yourself more employable. The response was, we can't afford university. Why can't you afford university? It's free. We can't afford university because the first day of class, our instructor steps in front of us and says, if you want an A in this course, this is what it will cost you. If you want a B, this is what it will cost you. If you want a C, this is what it will cost you. And they were simply saying, we can't afford the price of corruption that infiltrates every piece of our society, even higher education. Now, I doubt your professors at Purdue haven't done that. Maybe at IU, but they haven't done it here. So this is not typically how legitimate state systems work. One of the things we've been very concerned about in governance is a global retreat on democracy. Again, here's another democracy index that came out from the Economist Intelligence Unit just last week, I believe. For 2023, They've been tracking democracies for a couple of decades. They have their own quantitative measures for what a full democracy looks like, what a flawed democracy looks like, what authoritarian regimes look like, what hybrid regimes look like. And to make a long story short, we see year after year after year a retreat in democracy across the globe. The US has been classified, as you see here, as a flawed democracy since 2016. These things don't happen because someone's elected or not elected. It's a long-term erosion of democracy and democratic institutions that finally caught up with us in 2016. So these changes, these moves away from democracy, don't generally happen like they used to, which in the 70s and 80s, which would be the overthrow of sitting governments by revolt, for instance, by a coup. These are happening very suddenly, very slowly, with not much fanfare, but they're eroding democracy all the same. It's like if you were sitting outside reading a book and you have the sun and you can see the pages clearly and everything's fine, and the sun starts to set, and you can still read, you can still make it out, but at some point, without even noticing it, the sun's gone. You can't read anymore. This is what's happening to democracy around the globe. It's fading like a sunset. And small changes are happening that people don't notice or don't care to notice. And those small incremental changes keep happening. And at some point, a country like Hungary, like Thailand, has gone from democracy to some form of autocracy or authoritarian government. Second category we look at has to do with conflict history. And here we're particularly interested less in the history of the conflict itself, but more in that how that history is remembered, how it's taught, how it's processed, how it's understood. Because we know that when certain groups feel that their side of conflict history isn't being attended to, or their side has been twisted to fit some other narrative, that leaves lots of room for issues of vengeance and group grievance. So here we can look very concretely at education textbooks. We can look at political speeches. We can look at novels and poetry and plays. How does a country depict the history that it's gone through? Because that depiction very much will impact people in their sense of inclusion or their sense of grievance. I'm from the South originally. I'm not even looking at how the subtitles are translating some of what I say, because I'm sure that some of these words have to have been garbled. So I'm from the South originally. I didn't go to a school that wasn't named after a Confederate general until I went to college. When I went to college, I was a first-generation college student. I was terrified, went to a small school in Kentucky. No one in my family had ever experienced anything like this. I felt completely out of place. I felt like I was an imposter. First day of history class, the professor started talking about something he called the Civil War. I looked around me. I didn't know. I wasn't tracking. I didn't know what he was talking about. Other kids in the class seemed to be fine. I sat there thinking, this place isn't for me. I have no idea what this man is talking about. It's 30 minutes into it, it clicked. He was talking about what I had been taught, K through 12, was the War of Northern Aggression. He was calling it the Civil War. And once I understood that, I thought, oh, okay, now I know what he's talking about. But growing up with that war depicted as the War of Northern Aggression, and you being taught you're the victims of this War of Northern Aggression, and Brown versus Board of Education was another case of the War of Northern Aggression, those things absolutely influence how you interpret the world, how you interact with the world. So it's this piece of conflict history we're most interested about. We look at economic conditions when we talk about risk. This is probably the category of risk we know the least about, but we do know, for instance, that it's not simply poverty that puts a country at risk. Often people will say poor countries are the ones we've got to really be worried about. That's not actually the case. It's countries where there's tremendously unequal distribution of wealth that we have to worry about, that level of economic discrimination. So we can have a very poor country that could be very stable, relatively speaking. But we can also have a poor country where a few people in power hold most of the wealth. When that happens, that type of economic discrimination is pretty volatile. When a country doesn't have macroeconomic stability, so when a country doesn't have economic diversity, we can see that as a risk factor. Venezuela, we saw previously moderate risk. Venezuela fell apart because its economy was predicated almost fully on oil. And when the price of oil dropped several years ago, it killed Venezuela. It had nothing left to fall back on economically, and that's when much of the fighting in the streets started to happen. And then finally, I think one of the big areas of risk we look at is what I've called social fragmentation. This is the opposite of social cohesion. When we have social cohesion, we not only can live together, but we can work together. We can work together for mutual gains, mutual benefit. Social fragmentation divides us in significant ways that prohibit us living together at times and absolutely can prohibit us working together. And you see several key indicators here that we look at when we're trying to measure social fragmentation. I'll go back to Northern Ireland as an example. I'm a visiting professor at Queen's University in Belfast, and so I go back there often. And whenever I speak to classes, Queen's is the premier educational institution in Northern Ireland. Almost all the undergraduates are from Northern Ireland. And when I speak to classes, one of my first questions is, when did you first meet someone who kicks with the other foot? Which in Northern Ireland means, if you're Protestant, when did you first meet someone who's Catholic? If you're Catholic, when did you first meet someone who's Protestant? So these students are between 18 and 20 years of age at university. And when I ask that question, over 95% of them say, the first time I met someone who kicks with the other foot was when I came to university. Northern Ireland's a small country, but for 18 to 20 years, they've lived in such complete social segregation and fragmentation, they've not knowingly met someone from the other side of the religious national divide that exists in Northern Ireland. So those are the risk factors. That's how we can ascertain the stacks of wood that are present. We can get some good sense of this in any country in the world we spend time looking at. So just in the past 4 years, to give you an example, I was asked by the government of Burundi to do a risk assessment for Burundi. I spent some time on the ground. We had people on the ground who were also working with us on the risk assessment. We look at these 20 factors, we gather as much evidence as we can, and we're able to say to the government of Burundi, these are the areas you seem to be highest at risk, and you need to develop some type of resilience strategies for. I've done the same thing for the US in 2020, and we'll talk more about that in a few moments. But if we don't attend to the risk, if the risk is dousing gasoline, if there's a trigger, if there's a flame, that risk can go up in fire. And this is where risk becomes reality. People who work in fire services say there's this flashover point where a fire in a room becomes a room on fire. That's what we're looking at here. If we don't pay attention to risk, at some point, that fire in a room is going to become a room, a country on fire. And then at that point, this is a key issue, we don't put our hands up and say, we've given up on prevention. We're still preventing loss of life, but the options, like a person on the operating table, the options are much more limited. They're much more expensive, they're much more costly, but we're still trying to do the work of prevention. So in that midstream piece that we're in now, real-time response tools, here's the categories of response tools we could think about. I think of this as like a toolbox. And we have about, I think in the book, I described 20 tools in this box we could use. Now, one tool at the bottom of the box is military intervention. non-consensual military intervention. So the perpetrating government doesn't give us permission to intervene, but the world, the UN, regional organization, perhaps a neighboring country, intervenes non-consensually. That's a tool in the toolbox. It's the bottom tool. It's the tool that's got tape all over it because we don't want to use it. We don't want to have to reach for it. And we shouldn't have to reach for it because we have a lot of other tools at our disposal. So when the crisis in Ukraine broke out with Putin's invasion, now we're at over 800 days. When that crisis broke out, you immediately started to see some of these tools used to try to slow the suffering, to try to prevent additional loss of life, maybe to even try to stop the conflict itself. So we have a range of political tools we can use. We have, in this toolbox, we have diplomatic tools. We can recall diplomats. We can put political pressures on. Wide range of things we can do politically that look like naming and shaming is what they're traditionally called. We call someone out and we try to shame them. A lot of times bad actors don't care about that. I don't think Putin cares at all about naming and shaming. It just doesn't faze him. So many bad actors aren't affected by this, but these are tools we can use, and hopefully there's no one magic tool, but we use enough of these and hopefully they can have an effect. We have economic tools. We can do sanctions. We can restrict trade. We can threaten to not lift embargoes, a wide range of things we can do economically. And again, we've done this in Ukraine, but we've got another case here where the perpetrator is pretty well immune to economic sanctions because A, he and his country are incredibly wealthy, and B, they still have significant trading partners, particularly with China. So if everyone's not on board with the economic sanctions, they're a little feeble. And we've seen that in Ukraine. We have legal tools. And again, we've used this in Ukraine. We have referred, for instance, President Putin and one of his advisors to the International Criminal Court. Now, he has diplomatic immunity. Russia's not part of the International Criminal Court. There's still ways for us to bring him to justice there, but it's not going to happen soon. But it's a legal tool. It's a legal point of pressure we can use. And then finally, there are military tools that, again, not non-consensual military intervention, but what the US has been doing in Ukraine. Weapons training, weapons assistance, military assistance, tactically, monetarily, giving weapons. Those things can also be used as military tools to try and stop the suffering of people who have been targeted. So a huge toolbox of things we can do. And again, we don't just have to jump to non-consensual military intervention. A lot more things we can do here midstream. And then finally, let's look at downstream, because one of the things I want to challenge us with at the end here tonight is to think close to home about our country. We're not midstream. We're not in the midst of a crisis. But because this is a cycle, we should be thinking about upstream prevention. We also should be thinking about downstream prevention, because we are a post-conflict country. We're a country built on the attempted extermination of one people, indigenous peoples, and the importation and enslavement of another people, African people, for the economic advancement of people who held power in America at the time. I don't think there's any understanding of American history that can't start unless it recognizes those two fundamentals at the beginning of it. So we're a post-conflict country, like most every other country in the world is post-conflict. And I've come over the years, and maybe this is part of my time in Northern Ireland, I don't even know if there's such a thing as post-conflict. I don't know if there's such a thing as post-trauma. I mean, I think these things leave their fingerprints on us for a very, very long time. And so in my own writings, I no longer write about post-conflict, post-trauma. I talk about afterlives of conflict, afterlives of trauma, because I think they're still always there for us. So we live in a country that's dealing with these afterlives of conflict in terms of downstream prevention. This is a memorial from another country that experienced atrocities from 1976 to 1983, and that's Argentina. Argentina, over that 7-year period, was under the grip of a military junta, military regime. 30,000 people were disappeared, subject to terrible torture. No such thing as good torture, subject to torture, subject to interrogation. Many of the disappeared killed. 30,000 doesn't sound like a huge kill rate compared to other cases of genocide, but understand in Argentina, the way it worked, everyone thought they could be disappeared. No one knew the reason certain people were being disappeared and other people weren't. So every day people lived in fear that they could become one of the disappeared. How Argentina has tried to remember that time period is they have labeled many of their clandestine detention centers with these monuments that focus on justice, truth, and memory. And Argentina says for us to go forward after the abuses of military regime, we need justice, we need truth, we need memory. Argentina doesn't care about reconciliation. They'll say, maybe that comes, maybe it doesn't. But we have to have justice, truth, and memory. So for me, I found it helpful to think about downstream prevention in those 3 ways. What does justice look like? What does truth look like? What does memory look like? When we think about justice, we can think about a lot of different forms of justice. Broadly speaking, we could talk about retributive justice and restorative justice. Retributive justice focuses on prosecution and punishment. I work, as Rebecca said, most of my work is with perpetrators of mass violence, rank and file killers. So over the years, I've interviewed over 225 face-to-face alleged or convicted perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide throughout Latin America, the Great Lakes region of Africa, former Eastern Europe, Northern Ireland, all trying to understand the psychology of people who carry out these type of crimes, in addition to thousands of pages of archival work as well. If you're a fan of retributive justice, your focus is the perpetrators have to suffer for what they've done. They have to suffer for the harm they've inflicted. They have to suffer for the crimes they've committed. Now, in post-genocide societies, this is a difficult proposition because for genocide to be successful from the mindset of the architects of genocide, you're going to need tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people at the front lines willing to do the hard work of killing. So when genocide is over, what your post-genocide country is left with are 2 very difficult questions. One, do we have the resources to bring all these perpetrators to justice? In Rwanda, after the genocide ended, July 4th, 1994, there were 7 judges and lawyers left alive. Rwanda's legal infrastructure was gutted, decimated. So did they have the resources to bring people to justice? And then secondly, once you decide you want to bring perpetrators to justice, what do you do with them? Do they stay in prison forever? Do you have the resources to imprison this many people for the rest of their natural lives? If they don't stay in prison forever, what does it mean to reintegrate perpetrators into the society that they've destroyed? But notice that all of these questions about retributive justice are very perpetrator-focused. So as a complement to it, this isn't either or, as a complement to it, we would love to see some form of restorative justice that is focused more on the victims. What have they lost? How can we repair the harm that was done to victims? In Rwanda, it's been as simple as you tore this person's house down during the genocide, you tried to kill their family, least you can do is rebuild the house. That's restorative justice. That's victim-focused. So again, it's not either or in the pursuit of justice, it's both and. But both of these forms of justice really do tax a genocide after a society after genocide. I've written in one of the books, genocide overwhelms justice. And what I mean by that is that genocide is such an event of totality, like the eclipse. It's an event of totality that almost makes justice as we traditionally conceive it near impossible. So then the question becomes, how do we rebuild a society if justice can't be fully meted out in a particular case? Tons of truth-seeking initiatives we can focus on. We can look at truth commissions, solving the fate of missing persons, education reform. All of these are efforts to bring truth into the equation. I work often in Bosnia-Herzegovina, probably Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina are the two places in Northern Ireland, 3 places I spend most of my time. Bosnia-Herzegovina now, we're close to 30 years past Srebrenica, case of genocide, violence and conflict throughout the region. I know many Bosnian Muslim women who simply at this point, nearly 30 years down the road, say, they're not going to bring him back to justice. I'm going to give up on it. I know it's not going to happen. I know I'm not going to get repaid for what's happened to my family and the things I've lost. All I want, they say, just tell me what happened. Just tell me where the body is. I just need that closure. If I just that thing, if you give me that, maybe I can move on. I mean, it's a sad case that 30 years after genocide, this is what people, survivor families, are left begging for, is just tell me what happened to the body. I don't care if you're convicted, whatever, just tell me where the body is. So solving the fate of missing persons is a big piece. And then finally, memory. I'll give you another example here from Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I think memory is a big issue for many of us in this room as well. This is a town in eastern Bosnia-Herzegovina called Visegrad. At the time of the wars in 92 to 95, Visegrad was predominantly a Bosniak, means Muslim city. About 60% of the population of Visegrad was Muslim. During the wars and what were called ethnic cleansing, Muslims were attacked in this village. They were killed. They were thrown into the nearby river in hundreds, numbered hundreds. Many of them had to flee. All of them were displaced. Today in Visegrad, and this is very typical in the region, what used to be a predominantly Muslim city is now exclusively a Serb city or village. Muslims have fled elsewhere. Serbs have moved into this region called Republika Srpska, and this is now a Serb village. Muslims had erected this monument around 2010 to their experience in Visegrad. And as you can see on the monument, you see at the top the word genocidia, the word genocide. And it's saying what we experienced in this community was genocide. It's a statement of memory, and I would argue a statement of truth. In 2014, the Serb City Council said, no, what you think happened isn't what happened. That's not genocide. We can't have this on the monument. And this is unbelievable. January 2014, the Serb City Council sends a worker out with a grinder to literally remove the word genocide, to literally replace memory, to erase memory. Now, we deal with our own memory erasures in the US. Probably nothing quite as physical. Well, I guess we do some physical things here with this, but this is stark, how they dealt with it. I love the response of the Muslim community in the region, very few of who live in Visegrad. This is a close-up of it being erased. And they didn't take care to make it look good. That was part of the humiliation. We're going to erase it, and it's going to stay there as a stain. Muslim women in the region came back with lipstick, and they rewrote the word, genocidia. Here you see it. They did this for years. I've been to Visegrad half a dozen times. Every time I'm there, I see some semblance of this. People are still doing it. The city council still says, nope, doesn't go on the monument. Every day somebody's having to come in to erase it because someone has snuck in the night before and tried to put it back. This is memory contested in a very real physical sense. And this happens all the time in post-conflict or the afterlives of conflict societies, and we've seen much of that in our own society. So, final 6-7 minutes, and then we'll go to questions. Why does this matter to us? To this point, we've pretty much talked about this as a foreign policy issue, an international issue, but we're going to finish by bringing it close to home because it does matter to us. In 2018, I gave a lecture. I don't remember where the lecture was, to be honest, but after it was over, someone had emailed me and said this: I've read your books, I've taught your books, they're helping me win a lot of internet arguments with strangers. Now, just as an aside, it's not why I wrote the books, but that's how she was using them, that's fine. But she says, I'm afraid we're too late. We're too divided. We're too something. 2018. I remember being in a huge earthquake with a geologist who was more afraid than the rest of us. And now she says, I'm the Cassandra shouting genocide about her country, about this country. A couple of years ago, Monmouth did a poll where they asked people, and if we had been a smaller group, I'd have asked you, one word. What one word would you use to describe America? And you see a lot of interesting words up here: selfish, F word, terrible, train wreck, best, united, racist, disappointing, confused. But the biggest word you see is what? It's divided. It was the most common response by far. And chances are, if we'd done it here, it'd been the most common response. That we live today in what is increasingly become a deeply divided society. Deeply divided society is actually an academic concept. I teach every fall at UConn. I'm sorry, I swore myself I wouldn't mention UConn. I teach every fall at a small school in Storrs, Connecticut, a graduate course on deeply divided societies. And when we talk about deeply divided societies, we're talking about societies where identity is central to how people think about themselves, social identity, the groups they're a part of. But not only is it that identity is central, but identity becomes polarizing. Identity splits people. Identity determines who you live by, who you don't live by. Identity determines who you eat with, who you choose not to eat with. Identity determines who you decide to spend time with socially, and you decide not to spend time with socially. Identity has always formed that function in most every society. But in deeply divided societies, it becomes so polarizing that the two sides live in fear and isolation. Those students at Queen's University who never met someone from the other side of the divide until they went to university, what do you think they knew about those people? Nothing. Everything they knew was stereotypes. Everything they knew was fear-based because they had lived in complete isolation. I think we live in a country where this type of division, politically along political and social, particularly along political and social issues, has unfortunately become a defining characteristic of this particular time in our history. So I mentioned to you a risk assessment. In 2020, I was asked by the Stanley Center to write a policy think tank piece. It's about 30 pages long, using my risk assessment model that I'd used in other countries like Burundi and Northern Ireland to apply it to the US. And I did that. I wrote this piece. You can easily find it online, free to download if you're interested. And the piece was published 2 weeks before the presidential election in 2020. And in the piece, and please don't take this as arrogant, because, it's just in retrospect, it was clear. In the piece, my central conclusion was that between Election Day and Inauguration Day, the risk of political violence in the US was exceptionally high. The piece drew some interest. The publisher sent it to the New York Times. New York Times said, this is too alarmist. This isn't who we are. These type of things don't happen here. It's kind of odd because political violence is actually a big part of American history. But this is what I concluded, that the warning signs in the US are clear. If we were noticing the same warning signs of risk in any other country in the world, we'd look at that country and go, they're in trouble. If it was a Latin American country, an African country, or Eastern European country dealing with what we were dealing with in 2020, and again, not just that year, but decades of erosion in our political institutions and our democratic institutions, we'd look at those countries and go, something's got to be wrong. We have to be concerned. So while we're not a failed or failing state, we're a fragile one, we're a flailing one, closer to breakdown than a breakthrough. And again, this isn't a political statement of one presidency. This is something that has been eroding across Democratic presidencies and Republican presidencies really since the 1970s. We have tons of polling data that show us since 1970s, trust in all of our institutions, the president, the Supreme Court, Congress, those things have been falling off the cliff. Most recent polling still says that over 83% of people who voted for former President Trump in that election still think Biden is not the legitimate winner of the election. Again, if I said to you, here's a country where a large number of its population doesn't believe the sitting president was legitimately elected, you'd say, oh, there's some fragility there, some risk. That fragility, that risk is here. And the scary piece of it is we know that once political violence happens in a country, and January 6th was political violence, it is much more likely for that type of violence to be repeated in the very near future. We've done it. We've experienced it. We're still trying to figure out what justice looks like for it, what truth looks like for it, what memory looks like for it. But I think it leaves us very much on a precipice of risk again. So I'll finish here with 3 quotes that have been helpful to me, and maybe they'll be helpful to you. James Baldwin, the African-American novelist, said, not everything in this face can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think if you leave here tonight, this would be one of the key things I want you to take away, is what are the things we need to face as a country in terms of risk, in terms of how we've dealt with our history, or how we've not dealt with our history, of how we deal with issues of memory, or how we don't deal with issues of memory. We can't fix those. We can't change those until we admit that they exist, until they can be faced. Hannah Arendt has always been one of my favorite intellectual figures, and she writes this at a time in history where her language isn't as inclusive, but I think the spirit of what she writes is very inclusive. She says, the fact that we're capable of action means that the unexpected can be expected from us, that we can perform what is infinitely improbable. And I always push this with my students because I think, particularly after COVID, many of them feel there's nothing they can do. They feel kind of passive, that all of these changes, all these things that are happening are out of their hands. The incredible thing about who we are, as Arendt says, is the unexpected can be expected from us. The improbable can be something we can do. So I think it's important, particularly after COVID, that we all reclaim the agency to say, yeah, we're not congressmen, congresswomen. Maybe we're not sitting at federal levels, although some of you may be one day, but that we're in positions where we live now, the places we live now, that we can have agency and we can start to work on some of those risk factors. We can build social cohesion. We can be much more inclusive in the way we go about the work we do as institutions, as communities, and as people together. And in Howard Zinn, it's helpful for me to also look at this, that we don't have to engage in grand heroic actions to participate in the process of change. I think this is another thing that, in my experience of teaching college since the late 1800s, that it's difficult because students sometimes feel as if, well, I have to be big. I have to have huge responsibility. I have to be well known. I have to be really out there to be able to make a difference. And I've always loved Zinn's quote here that's, no, it's the small acts. It's the things you can do between the time you leave here tonight and before you go to bed to make your community a better place through social media, through simple things you do with each other, through interactions you have with people you know and people you don't know. Those small things multiplied by millions of people, that's where the change comes from. That's where the change has always come from. And I think that's something we need to recognize and embrace. If you're interested more in, we went quickly through all the three of these streams of prevention. If you're interested more in how these work and where they've been applied and the promise of them and some of the challenges of them, it's talked about at length in my book, Confronting Evil. Thank you very much for your attention to this point. I appreciate it.
So what I've sought to do from the questions that you've asked through the form and the QR code is cluster the most frequent questions. And so I've done this looking at, we've got a number of questions here that are all really excellent, I have to say. And so we're going to start with this one, which came up a number of times. What is the difference between genocide and modern warfare? What is the difference between genocide and war, and does it matter if the conflict is internal or external?
It's a great question. A lot of questions embedded within that. Most often, genocide occurs under the cover of war. But we have cases where genocide occurs in peacetime, and Cambodia is probably our best case for that. So war is typically, traditional symmetrical warfare is typically between two sets of armed combatants. Whether or not something is called conflict or war generally depends on the death toll between those two combatants. So for instance, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program in Sweden is one of the major sources that tracks conflict, and for them, their standard is 1,000. If a conflict in a given year has gone over 1,000 deaths between two combatants, they classify it as a war. Now, what we do in genocide studies is we're less concerned about the nexus with war. When I say we're trying to prevent atrocities, what I'm saying is we're trying to prevent the three mass atrocity crimes, or war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of genocide. No one of those crimes is worse than the other. I've interviewed perpetrators who committed war crimes that were given harsher sentences than a perpetrator who committed the crime of genocide and was convicted for it. So there's no hierarchy to those three, but often those three come together. So in cases of genocide, its distinguishing feature is not that it occurs in war, but that a group is targeted based on race, ethnicity, religion, nationality. I think many of us in the field would also add political beliefs, sexual orientation, gender, socioeconomic status. But when they're targeted just based on their group identity for destruction, that's a case of genocide. When I started teaching in the field, we always thought about genocide as state-sponsored. So we always thought about the classic situations like the Holocaust, where a government in power targeted a people for destruction. ISIS changed that for us. With ISIS, we recognize it doesn't have to be a state. Non-state actors can also commit the crime of genocide. And the final thing I'll say is policymakers spend a lot of time debating, is this case genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes? You hear this all the time. We debated this to death in Sudan with Darfur. Well, Darfur is not really genocide, so it's not quite as important to the policy world. It shouldn't matter. People are suffering regardless of what the crime is. We should worry about what the crime is when we adjudicate that. When it's gone to court, we'll figure out exactly what the crime is, but we should be able to tell when people are suffering simply because of a group identity. We don't have to wait for the court to tell us that's a crime. We know it's going to be a crime of some type, and we know it's civilians that need protection. So at the heart of what we've talked about all night is what's called POC, protection of civilians. Civilians who need protection in the face of violence from their own state or from non-state actors. They can be subject to violence from either side, but we know that they need protection. And that, unfortunately, is what the world doesn't do well. We do really well with humanitarian assistance. Rice, food, water, blankets, we can usually pull that off. we don't do well with protecting civilians from violence. Yes?
Okay, so the next question is about Rwanda. There were several questions about Rwanda. Rwanda recently commemorated the 30th anniversary of the genocide of the Tutsis. As a consultant on military policy, what do you think the U.S. could have done differently to foresee or respond to the violence in Rwanda?
It's a great question. Rwanda is a fascinating case study because it occurs about the same time as Bosnia and Herzegovina. And if you think back to Bosnia, what the Clinton administration decided to do was to actually lead NATO. It was a regional alliance, but really it was the US, leading NATO to bomb the Serbs to the peace table, because the images coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina were white people behind barbed wire fences that, if you took away the color, looked way too much like the images from the Holocaust. So that drew the world's attention. At about the same time, we've got 800,000 people being killed in 100 days in Rwanda, and our inaction there was notable. President Clinton still today, he was just in Rwanda last week, 2 weeks ago, for the 30th commemoration, and he repeated what he said often: the biggest regret of his presidency was what he didn't do in Rwanda. Now, you could argue that Clinton would have a lot of regrets during his presidency, but that's the big one. That's what sticks with him, is we didn't do anything in Rwanda. We could have done something as simple, without boots on the ground, as jamming the radio transmission in Rwanda from RTLM radio that was just spewing hate, and also actively telling perpetrators where to find the victims, where they were living, where they were hiding, and to keep filling the graves with cockroaches. We didn't have to be on the ground to do that simple thing, but yet we still chose not to do it. So I have always believed, and I think policymakers I've talked to who were active at the time will admit it as well, there's no understanding the inaction in Rwanda from the US perspective that doesn't start with race. Because they didn't look like us. They believed like us. Rwanda was the most Christianized country in Africa, but it was Africa. These things happen in Africa. And policymakers who are honest with themselves, and I wish President Clinton would be more direct about this, not just saying it was a regret, but also saying you can't understand the inaction without understanding the racial component for the inaction as well. And sometimes you see that very clearly in policymakers' diaries and statements from the time period.
So I'm going to ask, there have been a number of questions on the topic of current events in Gaza. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to ask one of the questions here. As we do, I'm going to say, okay, so the question is, to many, Israel's founding was a path to material empowerment and cultural agency to the Jews, for the Jews. Do you think that power comes with a responsibility to confront what the audience member who asked the question deems genocidal basis of political Zionism? So I think it's important to address this issue too. How is such a responsibility codified in international law?
Great. We could have, God, we were almost there too. We're almost finished. No, it's a great question. It's a responsible question. It was asked respectfully, so thank you for that. Doesn't always happen these days, but I appreciate the tone of the question. And I'm not meaning to sidestep it, but I'll say two things. One is, I don't think there's any way to understand that regional conflict unless it's through the lens of trauma. So there is the trauma of people in Israel, people who founded the state of Israel, and their children and grandchildren, of what it meant to live through the Holocaust, of what it meant to not be paranoid, but to have someone literally try to wipe you off the face of the earth, and to have the world be relatively silent because you had no place, you had no state to go to. So to understand Israel's response, which is a hyper-security response, hyper-military response, I think you have to understand the trauma of what the people in that state have been through. On the other side, to understand the Palestinian response to what they perceived as oppression, You have to understand the Nakba of 1948 and what it means to have 700,000 people forcibly displaced to make room for a new state that you have no stake in, you have no citizenship in, you had no decision-making power in. So Palestinians carry their own legacies of trauma that have been significant. So I think when you start to approach the conflict from understanding the perspective of trauma on both sides, to me, that's been helpful. Secondly, the crimes that have been committed. What Hamas did on October 7th is absolutely a crime. It's a crime of terrorism. Terrorism has no international codification, but we have enough regional codification, enough international law to understand what crimes of terrorism are. And what Hamas did on October 7th, absolutely a crime of terrorism. The dean at my school, dean at UConn, my dean at UConn, his cousin was kidnapped on October 7th. He's still hostage. I think my dean is coming to grips with the reality that his cousin's probably dead. I don't think there's probably a handful of those hostages actually still alive. So he's coming to grips with that trauma. We have Palestinian students at UConn who are, have been raised in the trauma of the Nakba that are trying to come to grips with what that means. And to get those two groups to talk is a difficult one. So we have the act of terrorism, October 7th, and then we have Israel's very militarized response, very disproportionate response. One of the things we look at in response patterns, and you're hearing it now after the attacks from Iran, is responses should be proportionate. Not everyone believes it. John Bolton is a former member of a couple different presidential administrations. Bolton thinks Biden is being embarrassing to the US because he says Israel should just try to outright level Iran. That deterrence is about showing you're the bigger power. You have the greater weapons and strength, and that's what keeps peace. Most of us who work in the field would disagree and say that responses always have to be proportionate. We can't keep escalating. So the question with Israel is, to what degree the response in Gaza has been proportionate? Many people would say it hasn't been. I think many people would say it's been indiscriminate. It's been affecting Gazans who were not part of Hamas, who did not support the terrorist attacks. And to that degree, we have situations where a court like the International Court of Justice hears cases against Israel. It heard a case that accused Israel of genocide. Several other countries brought the case. I don't know if there was much merit to the case of genocide, but it was telling that Israel showed up to defend itself. It didn't have to do that. It's not part of the ICJ, and I didn't honestly think Israel would. But Israel showed up to defend itself, which I think is telling because it shows it's taking these charges seriously, that to some degree Israel understands why the charges might be leveled, and they want to make sure that they have a strong response to those charges. So again, we will figure out down the road what crimes have been committed. Right now, people are suffering, people are dying, there's famine. World Health Organization's finally officially declared it a famine. Right now, the protection of civilians should be the world's priority. Courts of law will figure out what the crimes were later, but right now it's the civilians who are suffering. So again, I appreciate the question, and it's something about which reasonable people can disagree. And certainly at UConn, we've had these disagreements. We have a significant Jewish population, we have a significant Arab population, and it's been a rough go. It's been a rough year, but I do think we've been able to have some respectful dialogue to try to start to understand the perspectives people are coming from. But starting to weaponize the word genocide, it doesn't help with those dialogues. We will get to that question later. I think now, again, it's concern for protection of civilians on both sides. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The next question has to do with this age of information, which has come up quite a bit in discussions recently. Do you think in this age of information, it is possible for people who take part in atrocities to keep a veil over their own eyes to the actions that they have done?
Because they don't see it as evil, or because they...
This is the extent of the question.
Yeah. No, I think so. I think we certainly live in a world where it's harder to hide many of these actions, but it still doesn't mean they can't be hidden. So I think it is, I think what's incumbent on us, and this is one of the things early on, once the Ukraine conflict started, I began working with a group in Ukraine called the Ukraine Legal Advisory Group, which didn't exist before the conflict, but was a group of lawyers that had the foresight to say, we don't know how this war is going to end. We don't know when it's going to end. What we know is we want to collect all the evidence we can while it's ongoing. So this group reached out to me, and I did a series of 3-week trainings just virtually because the war had broken out with them. And the trainings were often interrupted by bombs. We had to do a training. They had to be next to a bomb shelter because it was the height of this initial invasion in Kiev. And in the trainings, I simply helped them understand what genocide is, its technical legal definition, what war crimes are, and what crimes against humanity are. I've never taught a group that was as focused and attentive as that group, because this meant something to them. And they were going out that day as they learned about these things saying, okay, we're seeing all this stuff on social media from Putin, from Russian separatists, from propagandists. We're collecting everything. And they have been collecting everything, and we're actually storing much of what they collect on servers here in the US because they don't have the capacity. So they're collecting everything they can find. They're not worried about what the crimes are. But one day, and I think this is important, they live in the belief, and I think we have to live in the belief, that one day someone's going to be brought to justice for this. And one day Putin's going to be brought to justice. Russian leadership be brought to justice. And when that day comes, that's not the day we collect evidence. We collect evidence from day one on. So when that day comes that Putin appears for international justice, we've got a wealth of evidence that can be used here, I think easily, to prove legally the crime of genocide. I don't think that's going to be a stretch at all, because the key thing with genocide is intent. Putin's been very clear about his intent in Ukraine. So this would be an easy proof if we can get to that point. And if we do, it's because we have this group of now about 45 lawyers in Ukraine every day collecting every piece of evidence and information they can collect from social media and elsewhere, again, in the hope that one day people will be brought to justice for this. And I think it's a beautiful thing to see them do the type of work they're doing.
Yeah, and that covers 2 other questions.
Oh, good, good, nice.
So the next, I think we have time for a couple of more questions. This one is, to what extent do you see laws and policies actually being able to create social changes that are large enough to withhold citizens from committing mass atrocities? What do we want the law to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the belief about laws against mass atrocities, this is going to be a real downer. So stay with me. Maybe we can finish with an up question. But the belief is, if we have laws against mass atrocities and we've punished people who violated those laws, that if I'm here in country X and I'm thinking about committing mass atrocity, that's going to deter me, because I know that other people have done it and they've been caught for it and they've been prosecuted. I've interviewed, again, over 225 alleged and convicted perpetrators. Never had a single one say that entered their mind. And we ask them, and they'll be like, yeah, I mean, a good number of them say, no, I didn't know those laws existed. I didn't know someone had been prosecuted, but I don't think it would have changed what I did. Good number of them say, oh yeah, I knew so-and-so was prosecuted. I knew there was a law, but I thought we'd get away with it. It didn't stop me from doing anything. So I think one of the struggle pieces I have with justice is, I don't know how much of a deterrent it really is to a would-be perpetrator. Perpetrators live in what I call expanded present time. And if you're a teenager or you've parented teenagers, you'll know what this is. That's that sense of the only time that matters is what's in front of me right now. And you don't think about future consequences, because my youngest son is Noah. He used to say that's a problem for future Noah. I had to convince him that's also a problem for present Noah if you do this. But this is that expanded present time. And it's how perpetrators live. They're not thinking about ICC in The Hague 5 years from now. Right now, they have a chance to do the things they're doing, and they're going to do them. So I don't know what laws we could have in place that would really be effective deterrents. What I'm looking for is, what other options can we give would-be perpetrators? And I'll go back to Rwanda. Most of the perpetrators I interviewed in Rwanda, and that's probably my largest sample size, they killed to get someone's goat. They killed to get the tin, the metal roof, because in the rural countrysides of Rwanda, houses are built with clay and mud. But if you have a tin roof, that's a sign of prosperity. They killed to get someone's roof, to take the tin off and use it in their own house. They killed for property. Sometimes they killed for revenge, but mostly it was opportunistic. If that's why they're killing, are there other structural things we could have done ahead of time that gave them more economic opportunities, that gave them better economic choices? Economists call this what's the phrase I'm looking for? Yeah, I forget it. But anyway, the concept is we have to make sure that for perpetrators, they have a loss if they perpetrate. We can do that by giving them other opportunities that they have a chance to gain something for. And Rwanda, to its credit, as critical as I can be about Rwanda today, to its credit, it's tried to open up other economic, educational avenues for a growing youth population that 30 years ago would have seen no future and killing made sense. But today, they look and they do have legitimate options for a future. So to me, the better deterrence is what we can give would-be perpetrators as other opportunities that make more sense than killing other people. I think that's, at the end of the day, going to be much more effective than legislation that we pass.
So for the last one, I'm bundling a few ideas here that people are concerned about, which is, it stems from, I connect it to some of the arguments here that not only are people capable of extraordinary evil, but they're also capable of extraordinary good. Mm-hmm. How do we get to extraordinary good? Yeah. What can we do? How do we move forward?
Yeah. That's a great question, and you're going to be disappointed in my answer, because when I first wrote Becoming Evil in 2002, I had every intention that the next book was going to be Becoming Good. It just made sense to me because I got this exact question all the time, where you've helped us understand how people do evil. Can you help us understand how people do good? And honestly, I haven't run out of yet trying to figure out how people do evil. I just can't get to the good piece yet, because I think there's still so much stuff left to do with the evil, and Oxford's been on me for 6 years for a third edition, but I keep writing other books because I'm just not sure I'm ready to go back to the evil piece, but I know there's still a lot there to unpack. So unfortunately, I haven't done a ton of research in what drives people to do good. I do think, and I'm influenced here a lot by Jewish tradition, which talks about Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Hatov, that all of us have mixed motives. There's some part of us that wants to do good, and there's some part of us that does some pretty selfish, maybe evil things. And that the challenge of life is every day having to decide which of those motives you feed. Cherokee tradition has the same type of saying that, are you going to feed the wolf inside you, or are you going to feed the peaceful lamb side inside you? And every day you're making choices about, what am I going to feed here? So I think if there are ways we can think about, what are the things we can do, if maybe you think about it as strengthening a muscle. There's a good muscle and a bad muscle. What are things we can do to kind of keep strengthening the good muscle, to try to think about ways to bring people together rather than divide people? To think about what I've argued with evil from the beginning is, I'm not talking about evil people. I'm talking about structures that influence people to do evil. I think we can also make structures that influence people to do good as well. I mean, this Remembrance Committee, your whole work is based in the sense of part of Remembrance is we're creating a social structure that encourages people to do good, to remember what happens if we simply stand by. You being here tonight, you've chosen to be part of a social structure, a social event where you're saying, I care enough about this topic that I don't need to be outside on a beautiful day. I'm going to be in here and I'm going to deal with a very tough to deal with topic. I mean, those are all important starting points for us. So I wish many is the day. I often say in terms of next books, I want to do a coloring book on flowers, ponies, dogs, those type of things. That would be good for me psychologically. But I wish I could do a book on the psychology of good and that I had it within me to do it. It's not that I don't believe it exists or is possible. It's just I have this rabbit hole of evil that unfortunately still has pieces of it that need to be tapped. But I think the structure piece to me is an important one. And again, it's just wonderful that some of you came here tonight to be part of an event where you're saying by your presence here, you want to be part of a solution to a world that needs solutions. And I'll finish with this. Genocide, mass atrocity crimes, these are all human problems. They happen because we make decisions that lead to them. These aren't extraterrestrial, supernatural problems. They're human problems. And if they're human problems, and they are, they have human solutions. And you being here tonight is a statement that you'd like to be part of that human solution. So it does my heart great to have you here and see you. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. And Rebecca, I'll let you finish.
Yes, thank you all Thank you, Dr. Waller. And thank you all for coming. It is a beautiful day outside, and let's move forward. Thank you.